Yeah, Bob Edwards and his attributes were critical in getting IVF to where it is today. It was his tenacity, absolute tenacity, both scientifically. They had to invent everything. They knew nothing. And it was his innate curiosity that he just drove him until he got success. And that's fundamentally it, innate curiosity at a level that you don't see in very many people. 1978, we made everything ourselves. We had nothing commercially available. And so we had to make our own media. We had to, whatever we did, it was homegrown and made in the laboratory. And we didn't know what we were doing either. We had recipes that we weren't sure were tried and true. So what's really evolved is the information about what it takes to make an embryo grow nutritionally, and how to do it the most robust way. And now we have commercial enterprises that have really perfected all of that and made life very simple, because you can buy everything now. You don't have to spend time making it. So that's one of the big differences, and the evolution of really high-end equipment that allows us to do things in a much more efficient way. Yes. So I'm going to start and take you to England. This is about 2/3 of the way up north into England, and you can see in the lower left-hand corner Manchester. If you were to head west from there, you'd run right into Liverpool. But one thing I want to point out is if you look in the northeast corner there of Manchester, you'll see the community of Oldham. That is where the first IVF took place in the collaboration between Patrick Steptoe and Bob Edwards. About a 4-hour drive from Cambridge. So you have to just imagine in those early days, Bob did a lot of driving to be able to do IVF, amongst many other stellar things that he had to do to achieve it. And if you head up northeast towards Leeds, you'll run into the small ancient mill town of Batley that I've circled there in red. And that is the birthplace of Bob Edwards in 1925, born decidedly into a blue-collar family. He had an older brother who actually was an RAF pilot in the war and a younger brother. And because of the impinging World War II, the family, when Bob was a young man, had to move around in this general area of England quite a bit. Bob, who by the way as a young man went by his middle name, Jeff, ended up north of here, eventually in the Yorkshire Dales on a farm where he worked, and he gained an interest in agriculture. So when he began university studies as a young man, 1948, in Wales, that's what he studied, as agriculture. But about the time he was entering his senior year, he was bored stiff with ag. So he decided, but he had become really enamored with zoology, and he wanted particularly development and wanted to pursue that. The problem is when he changed majors that late, he was afraid that had put a blemish on his record. He was afraid he wasn't going to be able to pursue any further graduate studies. But a friend of his said, listen, there is a diploma course in genetics that's being offered in Edinburgh, Scotland at the Institute of Animal Genetics. Why don't you apply? Well, just as a fluke, he did, and lo and behold, he was accepted. The problem was in those intervening 3 months over the summer before the course started, he had absolutely no money. So he worked as a laborer on the Manchester docks. He hauled bananas, heavy grain, any kind of menial chore and task that he could do, he did. And that's how much he wanted to study developmental biology, and thank goodness for all of us. So when he got to the Institute in those days was directed by this gentleman, Conrad Waddington. Waddington was a brilliant developmental biologist in his own right. In fact, he was one of the earliest people to recognize the influence of epigenetics upon cordoning off development with time. Very, very forward-thinking individual. Well, Bob did well in the diploma course, and Waddington really liked him. And so he invited him at the conclusion of that, why don't you stick around and work on your PhD here at the Institute, which he did. And he did that in the laboratory of Alan Beatty. So for his PhD, he manipulated mouse chromosomes, and he looked at the influence of those manipulations upon oogenesis and subsequent development. So very creative work that he did in those days. Also, while he was there, he met his wife, Ruth Fowler, who in her own right was a brilliant scientist, contributing significantly to our understanding of hormonal regulation of ovulation, also to genetics. So they finished up about 5 years later, and there was an intervening year that he spent in the United States, actually here at Caltech in California, before coming back and taking a 5-year postdoctoral fellowship in the north of England in a community of Mill Hill, and that's where resided the National Institute for Medical Research, and that's where he did his postdoc years. And that institute was directed by this gentleman, Sir Alan Parkes, and he is a story unto himself. He was a sort of a wonder kid. He was admitted to the Royal Society in his early 30s. Brilliant work he was doing in endocrinology, but he was sort of a jack of all trades. He called himself a zoologist at large, and he was a brilliant man, good director. Well, at about the same time that Bob was on his postdoc, there was an endowment made to Cambridge University by Mary Marshall, and it set up a reproductive lab in the physiology, in the physiology program, and it was called the Marshall Laboratory. And Alan Parkes was called upon to direct that laboratory, which he did. So he moved to Cambridge in '61. But he loved the work that Bob was doing. By the way, during his postdoc is when Bob became very interested in trying to fertilize a human oocyte in vitro for a lot of other reasons, of which infertility was one, but it was way down the road. He had other altruistic motives to do that with. Well, he ended up joining the laboratory because he was offered a position by Parkes. He did that in 1963. The problem was that when he got there was really no material, no human material for him to do his work in. So lo and behold, he was invited in 1965 to come to the United States for the summer, for 6 weeks of the summer. He was invited by Victor McCusick to join them at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, which he did. And that summer was very productive. He worked on a number of things. Among other things, he was introduced to two faculty members in the department there, none other than Howard and Georgiana Jones. And he became good friends with Howard. They actually worked on trying to achieve fertilization. They didn't claim that they did it over the summer. They may have, but they had very stringent criteria before they would make that proclamation, so they didn't claim that. So Bob goes back to the UK, back to Cambridge, and here he is shown, this is in the late 60s, in the laboratories, the Marshall Laboratory, surrounded by some of the graduate students. In the very back, under the hood there, that is Richard Gardner. In the forefront there, the bearded one, is Barry Bavister. Bavister was a graduate student, not of Bob's, but of the program. He actually worked for C.R. Austin. And during his graduate years, he was working on embryogenesis in the hamster. But one of the things that Barry discovered early on in that work was really pivotal, and that is the absolute pH dependence upon fertilization, successful fertilization. This is one thing Bob recognized probably that they weren't paying attention to. So he invited Barry to collaborate, and they did, and it's a long, interesting story, but they did achieve fertilization using these techniques that Barry had developed, and lo and behold, to me, that is a hallmark event in our birth of clinical embryology, because we couldn't make embryos really successfully before that time. So it was a very significant event. Meanwhile, up in Oldham was Patrick Steptoe, a gynecologist that had an appointment at the Oldham unit. He had studied laparoscopy in France under Raoul Palmar, and Palmar had taught him a technique of how to retrieve oocytes laparoscopically. He came down and gave a presentation at London that Bob attended, and that's where he realized, my God, this is the guy I need to work with. So they communicated and set up their wonderful positive collaboration in 1968. So that's when that began, 1968. And now they had a way to achieve eggs and a way to fertilize them, etc. And IVF really from that day began to have its positive potential elements. Two people, Martin Johnson from Cambridge University and Kay Elder, who had been affiliated with Bourne Hall and Bob for years, found the old notebooks from Oldham and wrote some marvelous series of papers about all of the discoveries and mainly the trials and tribulations that this team had to endure to achieve a successful pregnancy. And they published those papers. And this is just one table from that paper. And I show you this just so you'll understand the tenacity, the persistence that this team had to maintain in order to produce this. This is 9 years. And look down to how many embryo transfers they had attempted. And the first 100 or so, 102 were failures. I mean, I don't know how many people can go 9 years in a row and stare failure as many times as they did, particularly driving back and forth from Cambridge, and keep going, but they did, and thank goodness they did. It's really gave us the field that we're in today. By the way, I just wanted to show you, this is Kay Elder. Kay is a real gentle person who has been a friend, and she is a great educator, physician, longtime affiliation of Bourne Hall. And because she's been in the UK and affiliated, many people think she's British. But over on the left-hand side, these are some clippings from her high school years in El Paso, Texas. This woman is actually a Texan. So, yay, strike one for us. Well, the final road here. So it turns out in 1973, there was work going on in Australia trying to achieve IVF as a success. And there was a pregnancy that was had in the group of Carl Wood and John Leeton. Unfortunately, it turned out to be just a biochemical. But a few years later, even Steptoe and Edwards had a pregnancy in 1976 that they announced. That unfortunately turned out to be an ectopic. But after 102 failed transfers, they finally hit it. So here we go in 1978, the birth of Louise Brown. So we celebrate, this coming July will be our 35th year if you use this as the landmark of the advent of clinical IVF. That's Bob on the right holding the infant Louise Brown, Steptoe on the left. In the middle is Jean Purdy. Jean was their research nurse and a truly brilliant woman who was really a jack of all trades, both in the OR and the laboratory. She was just their utility person. Very bright woman. And Bob was adamant about the world understanding that she was an equal member of the success of that team. And they all held Jean in very high esteem. She unfortunately passed away early due to cancer, but she was really a pivotal person in our ability to do IVF. Well, Steptoe's appointment at Oldham was running out, and they needed to find another place to be able to do IVF, continue their work. So they sent Jean out to find them a place, and lo and behold, if you look to the west of Cambridge, she found the small community of Bourne, and there was a manor house for sale. And there it is, the Bourne Hall Clinic, which was purchased, converted into the first private IVF clinic in the world, still active today, and many good things happened in the Bourne Hall experience. None the least of which, in addition to having the brilliance of Bob Edwards, they had some young embryologists that came in that really contributed many things to their success and some significant things. Simon Fischel was one of the first people they brought in to work as an embryologist. But after that was this gentleman on the right-hand side, Jacques Cohen. Jacques had finished his PhD in Rotterdam and then came and joined Bob. He's shown here with Bob and Ana Vega from Spain in the middle. And he made a number of significant contributions, one of which I'm going to tell you about in just a second while there. He was also joined at that same time by this lady, Carol Fahily. And Carol is a brilliant embryologist in her own right. And the thing that I wanted you to keep in mind is that during those years, in the early years at Bourne Hall, in collaboration, Jacques and Carol were the first to successfully cryopreserve human blastocysts. And just think about where that has brought us today in terms of our ability to amalgamate genetics and IVF. Very important. So very good work. Well, before I leave, I'm just going to take a second to insert a personal note. I had the pleasure of knowing Bob. This was the day I met him. It was taken about well over 30 years ago. Well, I still had hair and it was still red, which is why I had this ridiculous nickname today. But nonetheless, he was a very warm, caring individual with a fund of knowledge like few other people, great sense of humor. But when you talk science, you had to have your ducks in a row. He was a very critical thinker, and he would hold your feet to the fire about your ideas. You had to be able to prove it. But a wonderful, warm gentleman that really was very altruistic in many, many ways. We were very lucky to have him, and fortunately, the world recognized it with the award of the Nobel Prize in 2010. I'm going to end that little era with this quote. This is from Aldous Huxley, and fundamentally what he's saying is people hate change. And they hate new things just in general. And so whoever brings about that new change, generally they're despised. And that is certainly what happened to Steptoe and Edwards, because they were chastised in the literature, they were chastised by the press and by the religious people and politicians, but not only that, their own peers. And it was the tenacity, of course, of science that brought about success in IVF, but it was their tenacity to deal with cultural issues, political issues that brought us to the point, because they faced a lot of problems in the early days. If you want to read more about those early days, there are a lot of books that have been written about it, but a real good one was written by another of Bob's early PhD students, Roger Gosden. This is a nice one he wrote a couple of years ago, Let There Be Life. And again, you want to read about the good and the bad times. This is a really good first-person account of those times. Well, IVF takes off. So the first success, of course, was July of '78, but right on the heels of that, in October of '78, was success in India. Followed by success by the Australians in '80 and '81. Before we leave that, I'm going to just want to say one note about the Australians. In addition to brilliant experimentalists, brilliant physicians, and tenacious people in their own right, they were some of the most altruistic people, and many centers were able to learn IVF from their tutelage and their ability to share their information gladly and widely. And I know, for example, Ian Johnston and Alan Trounson should be lauded because he was an extremely altruistic person that really helped the world. So you can see that following that in 81 we had success in the US. I'll tell you about that in just a second. But then look after that, 82 it exploded. So people were beginning to understand what we needed to do to make everything happen. So IVF Comes to America. This is a wonderful book. If you don't have this in your library, you should. Written by Howard Jones just before his passing. And it really details everything that they had to face to really undermine exactly what Sheila was telling you, that it was tough times. They were, as I told you, faculty members at Hopkins, but Johns Hopkins had an age limit, and so they had aged out and they had to leave Hopkins. But they were then offered a position at the East Virginia Medical School in Norfolk to start an IVF unit, which they readily and gladly did. Much of that early period, I have to really credit Lucinda Veek for being altruistic as well and sharing all of that information. Here she is as a young lady on the left and with Georgiana in the middle. And on the right with her husband, Roger Goslin. They hooked up and live happily ever after today in Williamsburg, Virginia. But she has been just wonderful about spreading this information and a real true fan and an absolute American pioneer. You need to know Lucinda's work. But just like what happened to Steptoe and Edwards, the same thing, as Sheila said, happened in Virginia. There was a lot of strife, a lot of criticisms, a lot of adversity that had to be faced culturally, politically, religiously to even get this program off of the ground. So that was one tough war that they had to fight. The other one was trying to figure out how to do IVF, because they were initially in 1980, no HCG, no trigger. They were living off the surge. So you can see that they had to do cases at all weird hours, middle of the night, etc. Tough times. In fact, in those days, Lucinda used to inseminate individually based on individual maturity that she would see. When she'd come in at all hours to see a polar body to be able to inseminate. Thank goodness those days went away. So in 1980, you can see they did 13 transfers without pregnancy. At that time, Georgiana began to do some mild stimulations, which was really another landmark event in the evolution of IVF. And they went into 1981, they'd done already 13 attempts with no pregnancy. But in 1981 was held the first conference, World Conference on IVF at Bourne Hall. And this is a picture of that group. And down on the bottom row, you can see beginning on the right-hand side is Bob, then Gene Purdy and Patrick Steptoe. But if you look in the upper left, you can see Georgiana Jones and Howard Jones. They were attendees. And it was during that conference that he got a phone call back from Norfolk and said, hey, we have a positive. And there it was. They finally had success. And the birth of Elizabeth Carr was celebrated. They appeared actually the next year in '82. This is the cover of Life magazine. And there is the Elizabeth Carr sitting in front of one of those god-awful Nikon microscopes that we used to use that had an air blower to try to heat it in there. It was the end of the world to use those things. And on the right is, of course, Lucinda with the Carr family. So we were off and running. But despite that success, there was still vitriol in the press that they had to face. And it was not true. They made accusations that absolutely were not true. And Georgiana didn't stand for it. She actually brought a suit and won it, and won a libel case against the newspaper company that had published that work. They also fought a lot of battles with the Catholic Church. And I really think it was the tact and the intelligence of the Joneses that helped us to get through those cultural and religious wars early on, that brought IVF to us in a much more rapid way than other people. They were not hotheads, and they were very cool, smart, intellectual people. So that worked out. So we have IVF, the creation in the UK and how it came to the United States. Before I finish, I just want to touch on some other areas where pioneering work has led us to where we are today. Just a few of them I've picked out of the clear blue. So I'm going to, just a word about embryo culture, cryobiology, and micromanipulation for male factor, and then finally reproductive genetics. Well, in the early days, the culture media that we used to do IVF was in no way intended for human oocytes and embryos. We borrowed all kinds of ridiculous media to do that, and it was just the plasticity of the metabolism of the human oocyte and embryo that allowed us to get away with it. But it wasn't until the mid-'80s, in 1985, that two people, Yves Menezo from Lyon, France, shown here, who had created the B2 series of media. And then the following year in '86, Patrick Quinn developed human tubal fluid media. He was in Adelaide, Australia at the time. And really, this was the advent of us making the first big stride into the ability to culture human embryos. These were monocultures. They would allow us to have success with cleavage stage embryos. Down the road, they were not good at producing viable embryos. You could grow blastocysts in this media, but they weren't particularly viable. And so what happened over that period of time is that we were beginning to learn about the nutritional requirements and metabolic requirements of pre-implantation embryos. We didn't know much about it. Much of what we learned came from really, I think, in my opinion, two laboratories. One was Henry Leese's laboratory. This is the University of York in the UK, a brilliant embryo physiologist, and you can see the litany of students that he had. And together they had worked out a number of the things that we didn't realize about the nutritive requirements for human embryos. You can see up at the top of his student list is David Gardner, and as hopefully most of you know, David and his colleague Michelle Lane, who was originally his technician and his graduate student and his colleague, were the first to really foster sequential media and give us the ability to produce viable human blastocysts. Now, they weren't the first to do sequential. That really was in Scandinavia, but they were the ones that perfected it and fostered it, and we owe them a debt of gratitude for that. As you know, unfortunately, a couple of years ago, we lost Michelle, but really an important creative team that has worked forever to help us. But at the same time, actually even earlier, is the work of John Biggers. John Biggers was from Harvard University. He had done a number of things in animal IVF, it was just in his collaboration with Anne McLaren, for example. But in the late 70s, early 80s, he began to study the nutritive requirements of embryos utilizing a very clever approach, and that is a computer program called simplex optimization. And this allowed them via computer to do an experiment, feed the results to the computer would tell them what to do next. And they would just keep formulating media trying to optimize components. At the end of the day, John and his students created a medium called Caseome. Caseome plus amino acids ended up being a really marvelous mouse embryo culture medium that would produce viable blastocysts. And that medium, you should all know, that is the progenitor medium of all media today that are used for extended monoculture and for time lapse. So all of the current monoculture you can trace right back to the formation of Caseome. And so those, I think, between the sequential approach from Gardner and Michelle Lane and of course the work of Biggers and his colleagues and students, we are really in a very good place for growing embryos. We're not at the end, but we're in a really good place for doing that. And think about what these contributions have done for our ability to integrate genetics, because without being able to grow sequentially or with simplex optimized media, these embryos, we would have a tough time. Cryobiology, there are a whole list of heroes that I've put on this slide that have made unbelievably important contributions to our ability to cryopreserve embryos. One person, if you don't know, I'd like to introduce you to is Stanley Lebo. Stanley was a brilliant cryobiologist. I was lucky because he came to San Antonio and he worked for 10 or 11 years actually in a cattle ranch outside of San Antonio that had a research arm. And I had the pleasure of getting to know Stanley very well. We did some things together. But he was a great cryobiologist. But if you look back, he got his PhD at Princeton. But then he did a postdoctoral fellowship at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory with Peter Mazer. Peter is shown here on the left. There's Stanley as a young guy in the middle. And they're sitting there also with David Whittingham, who is visiting from the UK. And they're slugging down champagne out of beakers because they're celebrating the birth of a mouse. This was the first mammal born from the transfer of a frozen embryo. And this actually appeared on the cover of the New York Times. So 1972 is the hallmark. In '86, we got proof of principle that this could be done in humans by Alan Troughton and Linda Moore. They did proof of principle. Unfortunately, the pregnancy they had didn't make it. It ended. But they should have the credit for showing proof of principle, in my opinion. Just another quick word about Mazer. He was a genius cryobiologist, and he really gave us all the tools we need to successfully do slow cooling. But down the road, he was also the one that showed us it's the warming rate in vitrification, not the cooling rate, that's crucial. So a very, very bright man. In terms of vitrification, the credit goes to another brilliant cryobiologist, Dr. Greg Fahy, and his colleague, shown here on the left, Bill Rawl. And Fahey and Rawl were the first to produce live birth following vitrification of an embryo. This was in the mouse. Bill came to San Antonio and joined Stanley Lebo on the cattle ranch, as he's shown there. So vitrification of embryos grew from that aspect on and extended eventually into humans. In terms of egg vitrification, there are a number of people that worked on it at the same time. I think that Masaku Uyama gets the large credit for that. I think he's fostered it as much as anyone, but please know many others, including Stanley Lebo and some of his postdocs, Gary Smith from Michigan, Paul Katayama from Wisconsin. A lot of groups were working on vitrification of the oocyte in those early days, but I think Masa has brought it along, and it really deserves a lot of credit. Well, quickly on to male factor. Micromanipulation was a big role that was played in developing effective tools to address male factor in IVF. Credit, I think, goes decidedly to Jacques Cohen for his early work in breaching the zona pellucida, also to Michael Tucker for similar work. Both were lab directors at RBA sequentially, and both deserve a lot of credit for early attempts to foster fertilization in compromised sperm. As you know, and then finally in the early 1990s was Jean-Pierre Palermo's work in Brussels, Belgium, that brought about the first successes with ICSI. But hot on the tail of that was also Michael Tucker's work. He was doing sperm injection too, and he had a pregnancy ongoing in the US about the same time Palermo joined Cornell. So I think he deserves a lot of credit as well. Well, to get towards the end, I told you about Richard Gardner. A marvelous career, but as a graduate student, he was working with Bob Edwards, and they were trying to sex rabbit embryos. No molecular tools in those days. They needed to remove viable cells from the embryo and then be able to stain for the inactivated X, in other words, the var body. That was the only way to sex them. So it was, as a part of his graduate work, he developed trophectoderm biopsy successfully. So when you're slaving away in the lab doing that, this is the guy you can thank for having that technique. But he did it as a graduate student just on his way. This wasn't his project. It was a tool he developed on the way to doing his PhD work. And ultimately then we ended up being able to amalgamate genetics and the tools that we developed to combat infertility with the first successful PGD that was really a collaboration with Alan Handyside from the UK and Marcus Hughes, along with some other collaborators. This was followed very shortly on the heels by work with aneuploidy. And I think you're lucky at this meeting, because the person I think that deserves the most credit for fostering that is Santiago Monet. And if you don't know him, you're going to hear him here in a little bit and also have the opportunity to meet him. But the early work with fish technology, with Jacques Cohen, Santiago Monet, and their work in reprogenetics, I think fostered that ability, and we've polished that along the way with other ways to study it. And so I think that's a good place for me to stop, because that's what we're going to be talking about the rest of the meeting. I want to end with this. Most human beings have an almost infinite capacity for taking things for granted. God, is that true? You can walk into the contemporary clinic today to see the wonderful pharmaceuticals that we have for ovulation induction, to see the sophisticated ultrasound and all the commercially available tools for egg retrieval. Then waltz into the lab. Everything is commercially available, state-of-the-art equipment. Protocols that are tried and tested. You can walk in and do that in this day, but just don't take it for granted. Think about the big, broad shoulders that we stand on being able to do what we're doing today. It's really, I think, a worthwhile adventure to look backwards in time and look into our family album. I think it's a fascinating story. Well, I know I've picked and cherry-picked here. There are a lot of people I haven't mentioned. I offer my apologies, but in the interest of time, here we go. Thank you very much. I want to thank my colleagues back in San Antonio that are working away this morning so I can be here. And thank you very much, and I wish you a very profitable Congress. Thank you.